Hello and welcome back to the Project Management PrepCast, where we help you remove the constraints in your pursuit of project management certification. I'm your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner. Competing project constraints is the main topic of this lesson. As a project manager, the number and type of activities in which you engage to successfully complete a project are often based on the different competing project constraints that exist on any project. In this lesson, we are defining what is meant by a constraint, listing the 6 major project constraints, describing how these constraints compete, providing examples of how changing one constraint can affect others, explaining how to balance constraints, and we are outlining the benefits gained when you do balance these constraints properly. Successful project managers all have one ability, which is to effectively managing competing project constraints throughout the project's life. This includes not only recognizing these constraints, but also making sound trade-off decisions concerning the constraints to help increase the probability of project success. It helps to put this topic into a broader context. In 1990, Peter Senge published the 5th discipline, The Art and Practice of the Learning Organization. In it, he coined the term tension, referring to 2 competing business needs. This could be the need for higher quality and lower cost, increased throughput with no additional people, or the like. What he and others discovered in their research was that when leaders, not executives, but leaders, when leaders identified these tensions and challenged their employees to find solutions to these problems, that their employees came up with innovative solutions and delivered amazing results. This dynamic has been true for hundreds of years. It took business researchers like Senge, Jim Collins, Tom Peters, and numerous other scholars to document it. Our projects are no different. Projects must respond to that tension. We call these tensions constraints, and we are expected to develop just as innovative a solution to make our projects succeed. We therefore start by talking about constraints. Project managers need to be in tune with the business, and so you should remember to look at these tensions as opportunities. In project terms, a constraint is a limiting factor that affects the execution of a project, program, portfolio, or process. Although there can be many factors that limit the effective project execution, there are 6 major factors or constraints that affect projects and actually compete with each other on most projects most of the time. And these project constraints influence practically every single area of your project's processes. The PMP Guide specifically lists 6 project constraints. They are scope, schedule, cost, quality, resources, and risk. These are all constraints that we as project managers must effectively manage to run a project successfully. There is the implication that a constraint is a singular factor because of the term a limiting factor in the definition, but constraints are rarely singular and independent. One constraint implies that other constraints exist. For instance, if we need to travel to a city a few hundred miles away and we have a constraint of $100, then we also have a constraint on how we get there. We certainly are not chartering an airplane, and it is much more likely that we are driving our own car, which adds time to the trip. In project terms, assume that our project cannot exceed $200,000 and must be complete by June 30th. However, as we get into the project, we find that the work is harder than expected and people need to work overtime to make that date. That raises the cost to $225,000. The type of resources that we are using and the time needed to do the work are in tension with the due date. The reality of our project due date is competing with our monetary constraint. There is tension. We must be innovative and come up with another solution. So why do these constraints exist and why do they compete with each other? It is because at any given time during a project we have only one or two driving forces that represent where the project's resources are focused, which can often change during the project. Constraints are used to help evaluate competing project demands. When these demands change, the project manager must decide which other competing constraints are impacted and need to be adjusted to successfully complete the project. This involves constantly determining the priority of each constraint and developing a plan to address the change. Changes are inevitable on a project. Both stakeholders internal to your project, such as senior management or the customer, or forces external to the project, such as legal or regulatory agencies, constantly apply pressure that adds or changes something on your project. As project managers, we must therefore make the decision on which of these requested constraints has the biggest impact, recommend a solution, and implement the approved ideas that maximize the chance of project success. It may seem odd that there could be a debate about the number of constraints on a project, but there is. Many businesses refer to the concept of an iron triangle, also known as a project's triple constraints. Those three are scope, schedule, and budget. In fact, there is an old saying that goes, scope, schedule, and budget. Tell me two and I will tell you the third. Even though there are many other constraints on a project, it remains in use as people who use the triple constraint model often bundle risk and resources with money and quality with scope. In this lesson, and to show you how you should really think about these constraints in your work, we break things apart and we use the concept of the 6 major project constraints so that they can be better understood and addressed. From here on forward, we will be using geometric shapes to represent the 6 project constraints. Now, shapes like boxes may not be the best representation of how these elements relate to each other, but they help us illustrate that the project must stay in balance. And we are using a balance to show how these 6 constraints relate. The analogy is not perfect, but it illustrates the concept better than a fixed shape. The balance analogy is helpful because we are always trying to keep a project in some level of balance so that the customer value on one side is matched with the value afforded to the group running the project on the other side. For instance, when a customer asks for more scope, which they value, the project team asks to get paid more for the additional value that the team delivers. Both boxes would get bigger and everything stays in balance. The example of balancing scope and cost is a classic case that project managers must deal with. But how would the 6 constraints apply to this analogy? On one side of the scale, there are the project's outcomes. That is what we deliver. Scope, what the project is building and what the project team needs to do, and quality, the degree of conformance to specifications. On the other side are the inputs that we use to make those outcomes a reality. The schedule, how long it is going to take to create the outcomes. Cost, how much money we are going to have to use to build the outcomes. Resources, who and what is needed to build the outcomes and run the project. And risk, how many chances the project stakeholders are willing to take. If we play around with the blocks, relative sizes, or weight, they can show how these project attributes interrelate. For example, assume that our customer wants to increase scope. Scope refers to the sum of the products, services, and results that our project provides, along with all the work such as management, planning, reporting, and so on. Scope changes may be introduced by stakeholders who decide they want to either increase or decrease functionality in the finished product or change some other administrative function, like reporting. Here's what happens. By increasing scope, we see we are out of balance. Our scale has tipped to the left. We need to change some other attribute on the project to bring it back into balance. And in most cases, when the customer asks for more scope, a change request is submitted for approval that usually also asks for more money. which means we increase cost. The money would cover the additional materials and overtime. This keeps the project in balance. By doing that, we see that the scale has leveled back out and that the project can move forward. Say, though, that the customer is our boss and he says, "No, we don't have any more money. You need to figure out something else." By looking at these 6 attributes as needing to stay in balance, we can see that you have a lot of other choices. We could maybe stay in balance by keeping the cost the same, but decreasing quality. How much quality needs to decrease to account for the increase in scope is the hard work that we need to figure out. But I'm sure you get the concept. However, we do not need to restrict ourselves to changing just one attribute. We could keep the project balanced in another way too, by keeping the quality the same and instead increasing the schedule, increasing the cost, and increasing the number of resources. We can keep doing these changes and see how we might keep our project in balance. Of course, we are not in full control of which items we change. The situation surrounding the project is going to give us an idea of what attributes to change. For instance, if we are working on a new manned space capsule, pacemaker, or any life safety product, it is a sure bet that quality and risk are not going to be compromised. If the project is for new product development, then schedule and cost may be the most important. Some industries are very risk averse, regardless of what type of project we are running, and they never raise or increase the risk. On the other hand, a bleeding-edge new product development company may chance everything to make sure the product has every bell and whistle possible. We need to understand the business to know what attributes we can play with. But enough about scope. What about the other attributes? It's a good idea to go through each one and see what common challenges they might bring. People most often change the level of quality without realizing that they are doing it. The way they do it is by reducing inspections and testing to decrease the project's schedule or cost. However, what normally happens is that the overall project risk increases because of the chance of non-compliant deliverables being rejected and needing rework. Of course, there are many other consequences that you might get into, but this one is very common. On the other hand, if you decide to play with the resources box, there are outcomes. Here are 2 scenarios. If you start reducing resources, you need to reduce the work you are doing by decreasing scope or quality. However, if you reduce resources by hiring better resources, you may be able to maintain the scope and quality by increasing cost. And when we look at the box with the schedule, it seems like the only action people want to take with respect to the schedule is to decrease it and deliver results sooner. I can already hear my sponsor say it now. Why can't I get this a month earlier? Well, here are a couple of common solutions. We can reduce some of the work, scope or quality, which never goes over very well with stakeholders, or we make the team work harder, try to control costs and add risk to the project. The result is that usually risk and cost increase in that particular scenario. Oh, and since we're talking about risk, it is rare that someone says, let's increase risk. But it does happen. With increased risk can come some great rewards. In general, though, people want to reduce risk. That is almost always done at an expense. Stakeholders pay handsomely to reduce a project's risk. However, risk is often forgotten, and people try to increase the scope, leaving resources, schedule, and cost constant. The outcome is that quality is compromised and risk increases without any overt action on our part. Lastly, there is cost, possibly a project's most emotional topic. No one ever wants to increase it. I have yet to hear a stakeholder say, here's some more money, just keep doing what you're doing. No, they always want something in return. The request is usually to run the project for less money, so reduce cost. Some other attribute needs to change. When ignored, fewer funds increase risk and compromise quality. I think you're getting the point, right? The point of all of this is that these 6 constraints are hopelessly intertwined, and you cannot change one without affecting another. Most projects fail when one of the constraints changes and appropriate adjustments are not made to the others. So as a project manager, there are some key actions that you need to take to ensure balance. First of all, changing constraints are an opportunity to provide the sponsor with information and options on keeping the project in balance. Work with your project team and consistently evaluate competing project demands so that there is data to make intelligent decisions on what changes need to be made to other constraints to ensure success. Focus the efforts of the project team and project stakeholders on the most important priority at any given time on the project. And lastly, ensure that everyone involved in the project is working toward the same goals and performing the tasks necessary to achieve those goals. This type of focus keeps your project on track. You may be thinking, well, these are just rules that need to be followed, and if my customer wants more work done, then they simply must pay more money or accept a lower quality product. Well, it doesn't always work that way. Some customers, like your CEO, are very likely to say no, and you have no choice. Figure out a way. This brings us back to the concept of tension. Strong leaders know how to exploit it. Can you do more work and not increase the cost, decrease quality, decrease resources, increase risk, or change the schedule? What if you determined that the scope is changing too frequently and you now need to switch the project to a different methodology? An agile life cycle might allow you to take on new scope, because in the process, the customer could see that some other piece of scope was not needed, or that shortly into building the requested item, the customer then realizes, well, they were wrong. This could decrease cost and reduce risk, shorten the time, and may reduce resources. Maybe when your boss tells you to decrease the cost of your project, you can implement a new technology, for instance, a composite over an expensive metal alloy that could reduce cost and maintain quality and not appreciably increase risk. In fact, the composite may weigh less and improve the quality. Innovative ideas elevate you and your team to delivering value for your company. There are other ways to leverage tension and fight the rules of constraints. Maybe you could implement some automated technology, or online tools might reduce cost and improve communication, thereby reducing risk. Or you could virtualize your team, increase performance and efficiency, and thereby reducing cost, increasing quality with only a slight and manageable increase in risk. Since outsourcing does not always increase cost, maybe you could get work done faster and decrease the overall project length while reducing cost and not affecting risk. The options are only limited by how innovative your team can be. Reflect on this and how it applies to your current projects. Before we close this lesson, though, here is a review question to see how you grasped the material. If your boss asks you to increase scope, which of the following would be an unlikely result? Is it A, increased cost, B, decreased quality, C, decreased risk, or D, increased schedule? I'll give you a few moments to think about this one, and if you need more time, please press pause. The best answer is C. It is unlikely that increased scope decreases risk. In most cases, risk would likely increase by taking on more scope. If the project has more work to do, then more can go wrong. Oh, and just so you know, this particular review question has caused quite a bit of discussion here internally, but in the end we decided that decreased risk is indeed the most unlikely result, because if you add more scope and therefore more work, like we do in this scenario, you are more likely to increase risk. And so Decreased risk, answer C, is indeed the most unlikely result and therefore the best answer. This brings us to the close of our lesson on project constraints. Here are some takeaways you should harvest from this lesson. A constraint is any factor in a project that limits its execution. There are 6 major project constraints. Those are scope, cost, schedule, quality, resources, and risk. Constraints interrelate and can change one or more other constraints, or can be accommodated by changing one or more other constraints. The project manager must balance these constraints to ensure success, and the tension between constraints lay the foundation for people to develop creative and innovative solutions. So, let's keep things in balance. Until next time.